The mountain pass lay silent under a bruised Afghan sky, 23 minutes after Viper 2-1 went dark. Colonel Marcus Hendricks stood in the operations center at Bagram, staring at the tactical display, where a friendly blue icon blinked alone in a valley that intelligence had promised was clear. The icon represented 12 Marines and one Navy corpsman whose convoy had driven straight into an ambush orchestrated with the kind of precision that suggested weeks of planning. The Taliban had chosen their killing ground well, a narrow defile between two ridgelines, no room to maneuver, no cover except the burning wreckage of the lead MRCV. Hendricks had already made the call he'd been dreading, telling the quick reaction force to spin up, knowing they'd arrive in 40 minutes. 40 minutes was a lifetime when men were dying. The radio crackled. Bagram Actual, this is Hawkeye 3-7. I have eyes on Viper 2-1's position. Multiple heat signatures on both ridgelines. Estimate 40 to 50 enemy combatants. Marines are pinned in a dry wadi, taking effective fire from elevated positions. The AWACS controller's voice carried the flat professionalism that came from watching men die from 30,000 feet. Hendricks asked the question he already knew the answer to. What ordnance do we have airborne? The pause told him everything. Sir, we have one F-16 with gun only 20 minutes out. The strike package is still refueling over Kandahar. 20 minutes. The Marines didn't have 20 minutes. Hendricks could hear it in the broken radio transmissions that occasionally pierced through the jamming, sharp bursts of automatic weapons fire, someone screaming for a corpsman, a young voice calling for his mother in the brief moment before training reasserted itself. This was the arithmetic of war, the cold calculus that turned men into numbers on a screen. 13 Americans were about to become a statistic, another tragic paragraph in the morning briefing, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it except watch. Then came the voice on guard frequency. Bagram Actual, Reaper 1-1 requesting immediate clearance for close air support, Viper 2-1 position. Hendricks didn't recognize the call sign. He pulled up the air tasking order, scanning for any aircraft designated Reaper 1-1. Nothing. Reaper 1-1 say aircraft type and ordnance. Static answered him then. A-10C full combat load, 3 minutes out. Hendricks felt something shift in his chest. Hope was a dangerous thing in a combat operations center, but it bloomed anyway. An A-10 Thunderbolt, the Warthog, built specifically for this kind of close air support nightmare. But there was something about that voice, something that made his operations officer lean forward, frowning. Captain Michaels tapped his screen. Sir, there's no Reaper 1-1 on the air tasking order for this sector. The nearest hog was diverted to Helmand Province an hour ago. Hendricks grabbed the microphone. Reaper 1-1, authenticate. What's your departure airfield and mission number? The response came back calm, almost gentle, like someone reading a bedtime story to a frightened child. Bagram, that convoy doesn't have 3 minutes for paperwork. I need immediate clearance or I'm coming in anyway. The operations center went silent. Every controller, every officer, every enlisted airman monitoring radios turned to look at Colonel Hendricks. The rulebook was clear. No unauthorized aircraft in the combat zone. Every plane accounted for, every mission logged, every ounce of ordnance tracked from armory to impact. The rulebook kept people alive. The rulebook prevented friendly fire incidents and international incidents and the kind of chaos that killed soldiers. The rulebook was written in blood and hard-won lessons from 70 years of air warfare. Marcus Hendricks had followed that rulebook for 28 years, through 3 wars and countless close calls. He was not a man who broke rules. Reaper 1-1, clearance denied. Maintain holding pattern and authenticate before entering restricted airspace. He heard his own voice, recognized the authority in it, hated himself for it. The Marines were dying, but letting an unidentified aircraft into a combat zone could make everything worse. Fratricide, collateral damage, an international incident if this was some Pakistani or Chinese observer getting clever. The silence stretched for exactly 4 seconds. Understood, Bagram. Reaper 1-1 holding. Except the icon on the tactical display didn't hold. It accelerated, diving toward the valley at a rate that made the AWACS controller actually gasp. "Sir, unidentified aircraft just went supersonic, descending through Angels 12, heading directly for Viper 2-1 position." Michaels was already reaching for the phone that would scramble fighters to intercept. Hendricks stayed his hand with a gesture, watching that icon plummet toward the trapped Marines like a falling star. Something about this wasn't right. An enemy aircraft would have engaged from standoff range. A rogue pilot would have announced themselves with bravado, not that quiet, determined voice. This was something else. "Get me squadron ops at Kandahar," Hendricks ordered. "I want to know which A-10 broke station and who's flying it." While Michaels worked the phone, Hendricks watched the tactical display. The unidentified aircraft, Reaper 11, had leveled off at 800 feet, screaming toward the ambush site at 400 knots. That was suicide speed in mountain terrain. One miscalculation, one moment of target fixation, and the pilot would auger into a ridgeline before even pulling the trigger. The guard frequency erupted. "Bagram Hawkeye 37, I have the unidentified aircraft on radar. Single ship, definitely an A-10 profile. Jesus Christ, he's diving on the eastern ridgeline. Guns, guns, guns." Even through the radio static they heard it. That sound. The distinctive BRRRRRT of the GAU-8 Avenger, the most devastating close air support weapon ever mounted on an aircraft. 7 barrels spinning at 4,000 rounds per minute, each 30 shell the size of a milk bottle, made of depleted uranium and designed to punch through tank armor. The A-10 wasn't a fighter jet. It was a flying gun with an airplane built around it. "Hawkeye, give me battle damage assessment." Hendricks realized he was gripping the microphone hard enough to hurt. "Sir, the eastern ridgeline it's gone. Multiple secondary explosions. I'm seeing thermal signatures running, disorganized retreat. The western ridgeline is lighting up. They're shifting fire to the aircraft." Another BRRRRRT answered that threat. Hendricks pulled up the Predator feed from a drone orbiting 12 miles away. The image quality was grainy, compressed by distance and atmosphere, but he could see the A-10 now. It moved like a shark through the valley, low and patient, each pass methodical. Not the wild shooting of a rogue hotshot, but the careful work of someone who understood that every round had to count, that the difference between Marines and Taliban was sometimes measured in meters. Michaels covered his phone. "Sir, Kandahar confirms. One A-10C departed without authorization 40 minutes ago. They scrambled after her but lost her in a canyon run near Salang." That explained the voice. "Who is she?" Hendricks asked. Michaels listened to the phone, his face going carefully neutral in the way of officers receiving information they wished they could unhear. "Captain Nix Cordova, sir. Call sign Reaper. She was grounded 3 weeks ago pending investigation." The name hit Hendricks like a physical blow. He knew that name. Everyone in theater knew that name. Captain Cordova had been a legend before she became controversial, the pilot who'd flown more close air support missions than anyone in her squadron, who could put a missile through a window at 3 miles while taking ground fire. She'd saved a British patrol outside Mazar-e-Sharif, extracted a reconnaissance team from Kunar province, provided cover for a wounded army convoy near the Pakistani border. Her gun camera footage appeared in training sessions. Her tactics were studied at the weapons school. Then came the Farah province incident. A compound on the outskirts of the city confirmed Taliban high-value target inside according to intelligence. Captain Cordova had been on station when the strike package was cleared hot, watching through her targeting pod as the JDAMs fell. She'd seen something in the moments before impact, movement, a pattern that didn't match the intelligence brief. She'd screamed into the radio for the bombs to abort, but gravity doesn't negotiate. 16 civilians dead, including 7 children. The Taliban commander had never been in the compound. The intelligence had been wrong. The investigation cleared the strike package. The intelligence was solid at the time of approval. Rules of engagement followed correctly. No violations of the laws of armed conflict, just fog of war and bad luck. But Captain Cordova hadn't accepted that verdict. She'd filed reports, challenged the intelligence procedures, questioned the methods that had led to the mistake. She'd made herself into a problem, the kind of problem that made generals uncomfortable during Senate testimony. So they'd grounded her while they figured out what to do with a decorated combat pilot who insisted on making everyone remember 16 people who were supposed to be acceptable losses. Now she was back in the valley, unauthorized and unlawful, risking court-martial and prison, and Hendricks understood exactly why. Because following orders had killed children, because the rulebook had failed, because sometimes the only thing between good people and death was someone willing to break every rule that mattered. The Predator feed showed the rolling inverted, pulling through a brake turn so tight that the airframe must have been screaming in protest, lining up for another gun run. The western ridgeline was still firing, tracers reaching up like desperate fingers toward the gray aircraft. Viper 2-1, Reaper 1-1 stayed down, coming in hot on western position. 30 seconds. Her voice remained steady, conversational, like she was calling out a turn in traffic. Hendricks wondered what her heart rate was, whether her hands shook on the stick, whether she understood that every second she stayed in this valley was another nail in the coffin of her career. Another burst from the GAU-8, and the western ridgeline went quiet. Bagram Actual Viper 2-1, a new voice, young and raw with relief. Contact broken. We are no longer taking effective fire. Request medical evacuation, multiple wounded. Viper 2-1, QRF is 8 minutes out. Hold position and mark your location. Hendricks switched frequencies. Reaper 1-1, Bagram Actual, silence. He tried again. Captain Cordova, I know you can hear me. You need to return to base immediately. Don't make this worse. More silence. The A-10 icon on the tactical display circled the valley once, twice, a protective orbit around the Marines below. Then it turned north, climbing toward the mountains. Captain, please. Return to base and we can work this out. The response came after a long moment, and there was something in her voice that made Hendricks' throat tighten. Resignation, maybe peace. Sir, with respect, there's nothing to work out. Those Marines are alive, that's all that matters. Reaper 1-1 is off station. The icon accelerated, disappearing into the radar shadow of the mountains. Michaels was already on multiple phones, coordinating the shitstorm that was about to descend. The Judge Advocate General would want statements. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations would want answers. The theater commander would want someone's head on a platter. Captain Nix Cordova had just thrown away her career, her pension, possibly her freedom. She'd violated direct orders, operated outside approved mission parameters, endangered countless lives with her unauthorized flight. By every official metric that mattered, she was a criminal. But 13 Marines were alive. 13 sons and daughters and fathers and mothers would go home, because a disgraced pilot had decided that rules mattered less than lives. Hendricks stared at the tactical display long after her icon disappeared, thinking about the weight of stars on his collar, about the distance between operation centers and dying men, about the mathematics of war that never quite added up the way the equation suggested. Sir. Michaels waited, phones in both hands, the machinery of military justice ready to grind into motion. Sir, what do you want me to tell them? Colonel Marcus Hendricks thought about rulebooks and bloodstain lessons in the quiet voice that had refused clearance, had refused to let good men die while paperwork was sorted. He thought about a pilot who'd seen too much death and decided she wouldn't accept any more. Consequences be damned. He thought about leadership and courage and the difference between the two. Tell them, he said slowly, that I authorized the strike. Tell them Reaper 1-1 was operating under my direct command, emergency circumstances, communications difficulty. Tell them whatever you need to tell them, but make it clear that Captain Cordova was following orders. Michaels stared at him. Sir, that's not. The logs will show. Fix the logs, Hendricks interrupted. Backdate the authorization. Make it clean. Sir, if they investigate, if they pull the recordings. Let me worry about that, Captain. Right now, you worry about making sure the story matches before anyone asks too many questions. Michaels hesitated for exactly 2 seconds. then nodded and turned back to his phones, already constructing the fiction that would save Captain Cordova's career, or at least buy her a fighting chance. Hendricks knew he was crossing a line, falsifying records, obstructing an investigation, all the things that could end his own career if discovered. 28 years of service, spotless record, reputation for integrity that had earned him this command position. He was betting all of it on a pilot he'd never met because 13 Marines were alive, and that had to mean something. The operations center slowly returned to normal rhythm. The QRF reached Viper 2-1's position. Medical evacuation helicopters lifted the wounded toward trauma surgery at Bagram. The F-16s landed, useless and expensive, and too late to matter. Throughout it all, Hendricks kept watching the northern mountains on the tactical display, wondering where Captain Nix Cordova had gone. Whether she understood what he'd just done, whether she'd accept the fiction he was building to protect her, whether she'd keep flying or whether this unauthorized mission was her way of going out on her own terms. One last middle finger to the system that had failed those civilians in Farah province. The sun set over Bagram Air Base, painting the Hindu Kush in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere in those mountains, an A-10 Thunderbolt flew alone. 3 hours later, Captain Cordova landed at a forward operating base near the Tajikistan border. She shut down the engines, climbed out of the cockpit, and waited in the twilight for the military police who would inevitably come. Except they didn't come. Instead, a lieutenant colonel from operations appeared, holding a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone delivering news he doesn't quite believe. Captain Cordova, Colonel Hendricks sends his compliments and requests you return to Kandahar at your earliest convenience. Your unauthorized absence has been administratively resolved. Nick stared at him, trying to parse the bureaucratic language. What does that mean? It means, Captain, that according to official records, you are operating under emergency authority from Bagram Actual. Your mission is logged, your ordnance expenditure is accounted for, and your presence at this FOB is explained by post-mission communications failure. The lieutenant colonel handed her the clipboard. You'll need to sign the after-action report. Standard CAS mission, nothing unusual. Nix read the report. It was a masterpiece of creative writing, technically accurate but omitting every detail that would trigger an investigation. Emergency authorization, communications difficulty, time-sensitive target, all the magic words that justified bending rules. She recognized what this was, a gift from a commander she'd never met, a lifeline thrown across the chasm that separated her unauthorized flight from a court-martial. Why? She asked. The lieutenant colonel smiled, the tired smile of an officer who'd seen too many stupid deaths from good decisions made too late. 13 Marines, Captain, that's why. He left her standing on the tarmac, holding a report that transformed mutiny into heroism through the alchemy of paperwork. Nix looked at her A-10, still ticking as the engines cooled, weapons pylons empty, gun barrels still warm from firing. She'd expected prison. She'd expected disgrace. She'd expected to be made an example of, the rogue pilot who proved why rules existed. Instead, someone she'd never met had risked everything to save her. The weight of that hit harder than she expected. Someone believed she'd made the right choice. Someone with enough rank to matter, enough courage to lie, enough humanity to understand that sometimes the only moral choice was the illegal one. Nix signed the report. She didn't know Colonel Marcus Hendricks, didn't know his face or his reputation or what had moved him to protect her. But she knew she owed him something immeasurable, a debt that couldn't be repaid through official channels. She would have to live with that weight, just as she lived with the weight of Farah province. The flight back to Kandahar took 40 minutes through darkness broken only by starlight. Nix flew alone with her thoughts, running through the gun camera footage in her mind. The Marines pinned in the wadi, the Taliban positions on the ridgelines, the careful geometry of death that she disrupted with 30mm shells, and the stubborn refusal to let good people die while she had weapons and fuel. She'd broken every rule. She'd do it again tomorrow if the same situation presented itself. That was the truth she'd learned in Farah province, watching smoke rise from a compound full of dead children. Rules were supposed to serve people, not the other way around. Kandahar Air Base appeared ahead, a constellation of lights against the desert darkness. Nix contacted the tower, received landing clearance, went through the familiar routine of gear down, flaps set, airspeed managed. The A-10 touched down gentle as a kiss, rolled out, turned off the active runway. As she taxied toward the parking ramp, Nix saw a crowd waiting. Not military police, not an arrest team. Her squadron standing in formation, silent and still in the darkness. She parked, went through the shutdown checklist, popped the canopy. Captain Jake "Hammer" Morrison stood at the bottom of the ladder, arms crossed, face unreadable. "You're a goddamn idiot," he said. Nix climbed down, exhausted and wired and unsure what came next. "Probably." Hammer's stone face cracked into a grin. "An idiot who just became a legend. 13 Marines, Nix, against orders, without clearance, and you brought them all home." The squadron erupted in cheers. Pilots who'd treated her like a leper after Farah province, who'd avoided her in the O Club, who'd whispered about her being unstable, suddenly pressed forward to shake her hand and clap her shoulders. Nix felt tears threaten and forced them back. This wasn't about glory. This was about 13 people who would see another sunrise because she'd refused to obey an order that sentenced them to death. But she let her squadron celebrate because they needed this. They needed to believe that they were the good guys, that their missions mattered, that the rules they followed served a purpose beyond covering asses and maintaining order. They needed to believe in something bigger than themselves. So Nix smiled and accepted their congratulations and pretended that her hands weren't shaking from adrenaline crash and delayed terror. Later, alone in her quarters, she would process what she'd done, the lines she'd crossed. The trust Colonel Hendricks had placed in her by falsifying records. The realization that she'd gotten away with mutiny because the outcome justified the crime. The celebration continued in the O Club, drinks flowing despite general orders about alcohol consumption in theater. Nix excused herself after an hour, claiming exhaustion that wasn't entirely feigned. She walked through the night air toward her quarters, breathing in dust and jet fuel, and the peculiar smell of a military base at war. Tomorrow there would be debriefings and paperwork, and carefully worded questions from people trying to determine how much of the official story they could believe. Tonight, she just wanted to sleep without dreaming about Farah province, about children's bodies pulled from rubble, about intelligence reports that were technically correct and morally bankrupt. In Cordova, the voice came from the shadows near the operations building. Nix turned, hand instinctively moving toward a sidearm she wasn't carrying. A figure stepped into the light from a nearby security lamp. Colonel Marcus Hendricks, still in his flight suit despite the late hour, looking older and more tired than any photograph suggested. "Sir." Nix came to attention automatically, years of training overriding confusion. "Walk with me," Hendricks said. Not an order, not quite a request. Nix fell into step beside him as they headed toward the flight line, away from listening ears and recording devices. They walked in silence for a full minute before Hendricks spoke. "I need you to understand something, Captain. What I did today, altering those records, lying to my superiors, that wasn't about you. It wasn't even about those Marines, not really." He stopped walking, turned to face her directly. "It was about the next time. The next convoy that gets ambushed, the next patrol that walks into a kill zone, the next moment when a pilot has to choose between following orders and doing what's right. If I'd let them crucify you, I'd be teaching every pilot in theater that mercy is a court-martial offense, that saving lives without permission is worse than letting people die by the book." Nix met his gaze, seeing the weight he carried, the calculations he'd made. "You're teaching them to break rules, sir. That's dangerous." Hendricks smiled without humor. "I'm teaching them to think, to understand that rules are tools, not gods, that sometimes the most moral thing you can do is illegal." He pulled a manila envelope from inside his flight suit, handed it to her. "These are the original logs, the real ones. No alterations, no creative editing. If anyone ever comes asking if this fiction we've built starts to collapse, You give them these. You tell the truth. You put everything on me." "Sir, I can't." "You can and you will," Hendricks interrupted. "Because you're not done flying, Captain Cordova. You're too good, and too many people need someone like you watching over them. I'm 53 years old at the end of my career. You're 32 with 20 more years ahead of you. I'll take the fall if it comes to that. You keep flying." He turned to leave, then paused. "Those children in Farah province, you didn't kill them. Bad intelligence killed them. A system that prioritizes expediency over accuracy killed them. You were the only person in the entire chain of command who cared enough to question it afterward." "Caring didn't bring them back, sir." Nix's voice cracked despite her best efforts. "No," Hendricks agreed quietly, "but it might prevent the next 16. If you stay in this fight, if you keep questioning and caring and refusing to accept acceptable losses, maybe someone listens. Maybe the system improves. Maybe next time the intelligence is better." He started walking again, heading back toward the operations center. "Get some sleep, Captain. You've got a training flight scheduled for 0800. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Nix alone with an envelope full of evidence that could destroy them both. She stood on the flight line for a long time, watching aircraft take off and land, the eternal rhythm of a war that had been grinding on for longer than most Americans cared to remember. 13 Marines were alive tonight. That was real, measurable, absolute. Everything else was ambiguity and moral mathematics and the gulf between legal and right. Nix tucked the envelope inside her flight suit and walked back to her quarters, carrying secrets that weighed more than ordnance. Sleep, when it finally came, was dreamless and deep. Dawn came with the call to prayer from villages outside the wire, a sound that had become so familiar it barely registered anymore. Nix went through her morning routine on autopilot, shower and uniform and breakfast in the dining facility where pilots congregated before the day's missions. The atmosphere had changed. People who'd avoided her now nodded respectfully. Her table filled with squadron mates asking about the previous day's mission, dancing around the parts that weren't supposed to be discussed, celebrating the parts that were. She answered questions carefully, sticking to the official story, becoming complicit in the fiction that protected them all. The 0800 training flight was a milk run, just time building and proficiency work over empty desert. Nix flew with Hammer as her wingman, practicing tactical formations and simulated gun runs against imaginary targets. It felt surreal after yesterday's life-and-death emergency, like attending a rehearsal dinner after the wedding. But this was how military aviation worked. Moments of pure terror bookended by hours of routine, the ordinary and extraordinary existing side by side. They returned to base, debriefed, filed paperwork. Normal, except nothing would ever be quite normal again. The weeks that followed established a strange new reality. Officially, Captain Cordova was just another pilot in the squadron, flying her assigned missions, supporting ground troops, following procedures. Unofficially, she'd become something else. Not quite a mascot, not quite a martyr. A symbol of something the squadron needed to believe about itself. When missions went badly, when intelligence was questionable, when orders seemed wrong, pilots found reasons to ask Nix's opinion. Not for approval exactly, more like confirmation that their doubts were valid, that questioning authority was patriotic rather than mutinous. She'd become the conscience of the squadron without asking for the role, and it terrified her. Because what if her judgment was wrong? What if next time she defied orders, people died because of it? The burden of Farah province hadn't disappeared. It had only been joined by the weight of those 13 Marines, pulling her in opposite directions. Don't act and people die. Act and people might die. The mathematics of moral certainty that made every choice feel like Russian roulette. Nix dealt with it the way she'd always dealt with fear, by focusing on the mission, the aircraft, the immediate task in front of her. Fly the plane, support the troops, bring everyone home, repeat. 2 months after the unauthorized mission, Colonel Hendricks rotated back to the States. He left without ceremony, just another senior officer completing his tour. Nix never got to say goodbye properly, never got to thank him for the gift he'd given her. She kept the manila envelope hidden in her footlocker, evidence of a conspiracy that had saved her career and possibly her life. Sometimes late at night, she'd take it out and read through the original logs, reminding herself that someone had believed in her enough to risk everything. That was worth remembering when the doubts got too loud. Her replacement came from the Pentagon, a full-bird colonel named Sarah Chen who'd spent the last 3 years pushing papers and attending meetings. The squadron expected another desk warrior, someone who'd never understand the impossible choices that combat forced on people. They were wrong. Chen's first act as squadron commander was to call a meeting in the briefing room, every pilot present, doors closed. She stood at the front of the room, hands clasped behind her back, and spoke without notes. "I know what happened 2 months ago," she began. "The unauthorized mission, the falsified records, the conspiracy between Captain Cordova and Colonel Hendricks." The room went silent. Nix felt her stomach drop, already calculating how much trouble she was in, whether Chen would honor the fiction or tear it apart. Chen continued, her voice carrying the absolute authority of command. "I know because Colonel Hendricks briefed me personally before he left. He told me everything, showed me the original logs, explained exactly what he'd done and why. He wanted me to have the full picture so I could make informed decisions going forward. So I'm going to tell you what I told him." She paused, making eye contact with every pilot in the room. What Captain Cordova did was illegal, reckless, and contrary to good order and discipline. It violated approximately 17 different regulations and at least 3 direct orders. By every standard that matters to the military justice system, it was wrong. Another pause. It was also the right thing to do. 13 Marines are alive because Captain Cordova decided that rules are less important than lives. That's the kind of judgment we need in combat pilots. The ability to think, to assess, to make hard choices without waiting for permission from people who are safely removed from the consequences. Nix couldn't breathe. This wasn't what she'd expected. This was an endorsement, a validation, a senior officer standing in front of a squadron and declaring that sometimes mutiny was acceptable. "I'm not," Chen said carefully, "encouraging anyone to violate orders. I'm not giving blanket permission to ignore the chain of command. What I'm saying is that we trust you. We select for intelligence and judgment and moral courage precisely because combat forces people to make choices that can't be run past a lawyer or a committee. Sometimes you'll have to decide what matters more, the rule book or the mission, following orders or following your conscience." She turned specifically to Nix. Captain Cordova made that choice. She risked everything to save people she'd never met. Colonel Hendricks made the same choice when he protected her. "I'm choosing to honor both decisions by making this squadron a place where thinking is valued more than blind obedience." The briefing ended. Pilots filed out quietly, processing what they just heard. Nix remained seated, still trying to understand what had just happened. Chen approached, pulled up a chair, sat down at eye level rather than towering from command authority. "Colonel Hendricks asked me to tell you something," she said quietly. "He wanted you to know that the hardest part of command isn't making life-and-death decisions. It's living with them afterward. Farah Province is going to haunt you. Those 13 Marines are going to haunt you. Every choice you make, every life you save or fail to save adds weight. That's the price of giving a damn." "Ma'am, I'm not sure." "He also wanted you to know," Chen interrupted gently, "that carrying that weight is what makes you a good pilot. The day you stop feeling it is the day you become dangerous. So don't try to forget Farah Province. Don't try to erase those children from your conscience. Let them make you better, sharper, more careful. Let them remind you what's at stake every time you squeeze a trigger or release a weapon. Honor them by being the pilot who never stops questioning, never stops caring, never accepts that acceptable losses are acceptable." Nix felt tears finally break through, months of suppressed grief and guilt and fear pouring out in an empty briefing room while her new commander sat witness. Chen didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. She just sat, silent and solid, letting Nix cry herself out. When the tears finally stopped, Chen handed her a tissue and stood. "Get yourself together, Captain. You've got a mission brief in 20 minutes. Professional, clean, moving forward because that's what soldiers did. Yes, ma'am. Nix wiped her eyes, pulled herself together, became Captain Cordova again instead of just Nix, broken and hurting and trying to make sense of impossible moral equations. The 20 minutes gave her time to wash her face, to reconstruct the armor that let her function in a war zone, to bury the grief deep enough that it wouldn't interfere with flying. She made it to the mission brief on time, took her seat among her squadron mates, focused on the task ahead. Close air support for an army patrol in Lagar province. Standard mission, familiar territory. Nothing to suggest that this would be anything other than routine, except war rarely gave advance warning. The patrol walked into an IED ambush 15 minutes after leaving their forward operating base, and suddenly routine became desperate, and Nix was back in that place, where seconds mattered and decisions couldn't wait for approval from people who wouldn't have to live with the consequences. Reaper 1-1, this is Sabre 4. We're taking effective fire from multiple positions. Need immediate close air support. Danger close to friendly positions. The ground controller's voice carried the tight control of someone managing fear through professionalism. Nix checked her tactical display, identified friendly locations, marked enemy positions based on the controller's description. Danger close meant weapons would be landing within 600 meters of friendly troops, close enough that any mistake would kill Americans. This was the math that made close air support the most demanding mission in military aviation. The margin for error measured in meters, the difference between saving lives and ending them determined by calculations made at 400 knots with someone shooting at you. Sabre 4, Reaper 1-1, I have your position marked. Confirm you want gun run on compound north of your location. She kept her voice calm, professional, giving the ground controller a moment to double-check, to make absolutely certain they both understood where friendlies were and where death was about to fall. Reaper, confirmed. Compound north, 600 meters from my position. Multiple shooters in windows and on rooftop. Nix lined up her approach, checking angle and airspeed and wind, running through the mental calculations that would determine whether her bullets went where she intended or where chaos sent them. Sabre 4, Reaper 1-1 is in hot. The A-10 dove toward the compound, nose dropping until the target filled her heads-up display. She could see muzzle flashes from the windows, tracers reaching toward the pinned patrol. Her finger rested on the trigger, gentle pressure maintained while she verified one last time that she was aimed at enemies and not friends. Then she squeezed, and the GAU-8 roared, and 30mm shells transformed the compound's north wall into expanding clouds of dust and debris. She pulled off target, gained altitude, circled back to assess damage. Sabre 4, Reaper 1-1, what's your status? Reaper, contact broken on the north side, still taking fire from structures to our east. 3 more gun runs followed, each one carefully coordinated, each one threading the needle between supporting the patrol and killing them. By the time ammunition ran low, the Army patrol had broken contact and withdrawn to safer positions. No American casualties, no friendly fire, no Farah Province repetitions, just a successful mission that would generate exactly 3 lines in tonight's summary report. Nix felt the post-combat adrenaline crash starting as she flew back toward Kandahar, hands beginning to shake now that immediate necessity had passed. Another mission completed, another set of lives saved or ended, another entry in the ledger she maintained in her head, the running total of people who owed their continued existence to decisions she'd made in fractions of seconds. Landing, shutdown, debrief. The routine that made war manageable by breaking it into digestible pieces. Nix went through the motions, answered questions about weapon effectiveness and enemy tactics, provided information that would be synthesized into reports that might inform future operations. All professional, clean, devoid of the emotional weight that she'd learned to compartmentalize. That weight came later, alone in her quarters, when she had time.